let's jump into our analysis of Taiwan. So, our buddy Danny Haifong, Spirit of Ho on Twitter, as in Ho Chi Minh, made this really interesting tweet. I'm sure he got a lot of backlash for this tweet, or maybe not. Maybe this tweet didn't make it to the wrong people, make it to the reactionaries. But he said, Taiwan is not a country. Taiwan is part of China. Don't take my word for it. Read the three U.S. joint communiques with China, the U.S. China joint communiques, the UN Resolution 2758, and the Constitution of the Republic of China established by the KMT on Taiwan, the Kuomintang. So when I saw this, I was quite interested. Obviously, I agree with what Danny said, but I had never read these three pieces of information. And I thought it would be really valuable to know what the basis of Taiwan-China relations are, what the U.S. has said about them in the past, what the UN has said about them in the past, and what the Kuomintang has said about them in the past, or what the Taiwanese have said about it in the past. So I went ahead and read all three of these pieces of information so you don't have to. And now we will discuss them. So, yeah. So the first one that I want to talk about is the U.S. China joint communiques. So these were a series of communications between U.S. and China that established diplomatic relations between the countries during China's reform and opening up period, when they were opening up to more private markets. But it also focuses on Taiwan specifically, and lays the foundation for U.S. China relations in relationship to Taiwan. Um, so in the first communique, the first of the three, which was in 1972, I believe. Here it is. Here's all three of them compiled together for us. The U.S. formally acknowledged that all of China on both sides of the Taiwan Strait is one China. Right. So the U.S. themselves say that there is one China. It includes mainland China and it includes Taiwan. Taiwan has been a part of China forever. The Taiwanese people see themselves as being part of China. The mainland and the people across the way across the Taiwan Strait both see themselves as being part of the same country. The U.S. is going to recognize this formally and legally. That's what the first communique did. The second one recognized the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as the sole government of China. So not the ROC, not the nationalist government or the nationalist political group, but only the People's Republic, which includes mainland China and Taiwan. So the U.S. at this time promised to end all formal relations with the ROC in Taiwan while maintaining economic and cultural ties. So they said we're no longer going to recognize Taiwan as if it's its own independent country, its own independent government, separate from the PRC, separate from the mainland, run by the ROC. But instead, we see it as being part of the PRC. We see them being the same as China, and we won't like sanction them or stop trading with them or stop engaging in economic activity with them. We will continue to engage in economic activity with Taiwan while recognizing that Taiwan is part of China. And at this time, with China's reform and opening up, the U.S. was creating stronger economic ties with China in general. So it made sense that they would make this political agreement while continuing economic and cultural ties to Taiwan. So basically agreeing that Taiwan is part of China and agreeing that they wouldn't attack Taiwan or engage in economic warfare against Taiwan. So the third communique came later in 1982, and this confirmed the first two, but the U.S. also said at this point they will continue to sell arms to Taiwan in proportion to China's militarization of Taiwan. So as China moves towards reunification, the U.S. will increase arms sales to Taiwan, although we agree that Taiwan is part of China. So you can already see the hypocrisy in U.S. policy. And the third communique came with 6 assurances, which were granted to the U.S. by Taiwan, and were proposed by the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, who previously ruled China and who fought against the communists in the Chinese Civil War, and then fled to Taiwan after the Civil War, which is why this situation is the way it is. And the six assurances said that the U.S. would not play a mediating role between the mainland and Taiwan, and that the U.S. would allow Chinese people to do this. So, Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. There were a lot of Taiwanese people and, people who don't support communism in China who were very mad at Nancy Pelosi because this is the U.S. going back on what they said with the six assurances and trying to mediate the deal between Taiwan and China in a way that's beneficial to them. The U.S. even recently threatened to blow up Taiwan's semiconductor facilities, which kind of goes back on their promise to not exert any pressure on Taiwan, which was also part of the six assurances. So not only is the U.S. screwing over China and lying to China and going back on their promises to the PRC, but the people of Taiwan as well, right? The people of Taiwan don't want this. The people of Taiwan see the people in mainland China as their brothers and sisters, as their countrymen. They see it as all one country, and the U.S. is trying to support separatism and just use Taiwan as an outpost, as a way to attack mainland China the same way they're using Ukraine to attack Russia right now. So yeah, that's the three communiques. Very interesting to read. You see that they lay the basis for relations between China and Taiwan, which the U.S. is supposed to respect and which they have not. And if you read the actual communiques, I just kind of gave a summary, but there are also some interesting aspects in it that I didn't mention yet. Like China pressuring the U.S. to relax aggression, not only against themselves, but against their allies as well. So the U.S. China talks about the reunification of Korea. They try and get the U.S. to leave Pakistan, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, all these different countries alone. And they say that the U.S. is not respecting territorial sovereignty when they do things like drop tons and tons of Agent Orange and napalm on Vietnam. So even though China is forging closer economic and political relations with the U.S. at this point, they're still, pressuring the U.S. to stop with their imperialist, murderous aggression around the world. It's also very interesting. They say, and this is a direct quote from the communiques, China says, China will never be a superpower and it opposes hegemony and power politics of any kind. The Chinese side stated that it firmly supports the struggles of all the oppressed people and nations for freedom and liberation, and that the people of all countries have the right to choose their social systems according to their own wishes and the right to safeguard the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of their own countries, and oppose foreign aggression, interference, control, and subversion. All foreign troops should be withdrawn to their own countries. So that was China straight up said that to the U.S. We support oppressed groups, including the oppressed groups that are being oppressed by you, and we support all movements for liberation and national self-determination. Which, at the time, the colonial world, formerly colonial world, was becoming the anti-colonial world, and all these countries in Africa or Latin America were rising up and demanding their sovereignty, demanding that these Western colonial occupiers GTFO. And that was followed by a lot of them supporting socialism. But you have China and the Soviet Union who supported this every step of the way. Stalin wrote Marxism and the National Question, which laid out their position on these national liberation movements. And they said, even if these countries aren't socialist, if they aren't communist, even if they don't have our same political and economic system, we will support their struggle for sovereignty because we believe in the right of a nation of people to determine their own future, to determine their own system. So China is confirming that in the communique and confirming that directly to the U.S., saying we will not stop supporting liberation movements and the movements of oppressed groups. The U.S. gave a bunch of lip service to sovereignty in their communique, but obviously, one of the communiques on their side was written by Ronald Reagan, who funded the Contras by facilitating the sale of crack cocaine in primarily black neighborhoods in the U.S. in order to fund their right-wing extremist paramilitary death squads, their fascistic death squads in Nicaragua that killed thousands of thousands of Sandinista liberation fighters. So the U.S. didn't really follow through on their lip service to protect sovereignty. Yeah. So the next piece of piece of legislation, I guess, that Danny Haiphong talks about is the UN Resolution 2758. So this is the restoration, what's it called? The restoration of the lawful rights of the People's Republic of China in the United Nations. This one's really short. It's just a small little, I got to translate it to English here real quick. Just a small little resolution that, again, happened in 1971, right as China was going through their reform and opening up period, allowing for a few more markets and more economic activity, more interaction with the West. And if you want to learn about the market reform period specifically and what prompted all these political changes and these political moves, check out our video on the construction of modern China, Midwestern Marx. That'll talk about the reform and opening up period, what it did, why China was forging closer relations with the U.S., how they're not socialist, even though they opened themselves up to a few more markets. Yeah, and all that. And it'll really give you an idea of the economic developments that were driving these political developments. So, anyways, here's what the resolution says. It says, the General Assembly, recalling the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, considering that the restoration of the lawful rights of the People's Republic of China is essential, both for the protection of the Charter of the United Nations and for the cause that the United Nations must serve under the Charter, recognizing that the representatives of the government of the People's Republic of China are the only lawful representatives to China, to the United Nations, and that the People's Republic of China is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So saying that because China is a member of the United Nations Charter and China is actually a member of the 5-country Security Council that involves China, the Soviet Union at the time, now Russia, the U.S., U.K., and France, they will now recognize the PRC and not this ROC government that fled to Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War. So it says, the Security Council decides to restore all its rights to the People's Republic of China and recognize the representatives of its government as the only legitimate representative of China to the United Nations, and to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place where they unlawfully occupy at the United Nations and in all the organizations related to it. So we only recognize the PRC at the United Nations, and we no longer recognize this unlawful government. There is one China. It includes Taiwan and the mainland. So when the U.S. does all this stuff talking about how Taiwan should be independent, or when Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan to inflame tensions with China, they're completely going against international law and the agreements that they made. And this is why nobody in the world trusts the United States, right? I always say, think of geopolitical situations like an interpersonal situation, right? If you knew someone who kept making agreements with you, kept promising to do something and putting it down in writing, and then whenever it was convenient for them, they just changed their mind and said no, and then moved to attacking you and started doing the opposite of what they said and trying to destabilize your country, right? It's not your country, and trying to hurt you and lying about it to everyone else who calls them out about it, you wouldn't trust them anymore. This is why the world is starting to move away from trusting the U.S. Because every time the U.S. makes some agreement, says they're not going to do something, they go back on it. They promised they wouldn't expand NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They did. They promised to respect country sovereignty. They absolutely didn't. They promised to respect the one China policy and see the PRC as the only legitimate government in China. They didn't. They did for a while. Then it wasn't convenient for them economically. Now they're not. So these guys are just blatant liars. They're just blatant liars. Like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and all these people talking about the sovereignty of Taiwan and how we need to support Taiwanese independence. Taiwan, the Taiwanese people see themselves as being part of the mainland, right? And a lot of them recognize that you're trying to use them as puppets. You're trying to use them as tools to attack mainland China and to attack the PRC. And they want, they want to do reunification or not reunification their own way. They want to make their own decisions. But the U.S. can't have that. And what's so gross is the U.S. always tries to pretend like we're the good guys. We're helping them. And then if you don't think Taiwan is its own independent country, if you agree with the vast majority of Taiwanese people, instead of agreeing with the U.S. State Department, you're treated like you're evil, you're a dick. Oh, what, don't you care about the people of Taiwan? Don't you care about the people of Taiwan and their independence? I do care about the people of Taiwan, right? So I'm going to respect what they want. I'm going to respect what the people of China have agreed upon and what we have agreed upon with them in writing, legally, at the freaking UN. You disgusting liars. It's frustrating to have a group of lying, deceiving, ultra wealthy elites at the head of your country. And then Nancy Pelosi acts like she's a hero, acts like she's a girl boss for going to Taiwan and pushing us closer to World War III. So it's the weaponization of compassion again that they always use. And then they pretend like they're the good guys. So the last little piece of information that Danny talked about here in his tweet was the Constitution of the Republic of China in Taiwan. So this is the ROC Constitution adopted in December 1946 by the nationalists who were opposed to the communists. And this constitution was actually decided upon before the Communist Party took power. So when the Civil War was still ongoing, when the nationalist government was in power of China, they wrote a constitution saying that Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan is part of the mainland, right? The main purpose of this constitution was to establish sovereignty, to establish borders for China. And again, this was before the communists were in power. And it was established that Taiwan was part of China. So China did not invent this idea that Taiwan is part of China. It's not the communists trying to seize Taiwan. The communists inherited the claim to Taiwan from the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang and the nationalists were in charge of China. They created a constitution saying Taiwan is part of China, and then the communists came to control China. And then the communists said, we're going to stick with this constitution in terms of sovereignty because that's what the people want, because Taiwan has been part of China for like 1,000 years. So this narrative that it was the communists who seized Taiwan from its rightful owners is absurd. And the ROC, the Kuomintang nationalists who then fled to Taiwan after the Civil War, still see themselves as part of the mainland, right? The Kuomintang don't like the U.S.-backed separatists who think that Taiwan should be its own country, separate from China, which makes up a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the country. So as I said, this lays the basis for representation in the governmental system in Taiwan. It's changed a lot since the 40s and especially since the 80s and 90s, because obviously the situation has changed. So at one point, the U.S. puppets arguing for Taiwanese independence, who are essentially just separatists, separatist extremists in Taiwan who are only really exist because of U.S. funding and U.S. support. And many of the hashtag Free Taiwan people exist outside of Taiwan, outside of China. They live in the U.S. or wherever. There's not a lot of people who think that in Taiwan itself. But the political party that does represent Taiwanese independence, Taiwan splitting from China, tried to repeal this constitution. They tried to repeal the Constitution in the early 2000s or the 90s. I can't remember exactly when, but it was blocked by the Kuomintang. It was blocked by the nationalists, the people who fought against China with U.S. backing in the Chinese Civil War, because the Kuomintang see themselves as being part of China, right? So this is what I mean. There are these political parties, especially in Taiwan, where they have a multi-party system, that don't like the Chinese communists, that don't agree with communism, don't agree with the PRC fully, even though they may see themselves as, technically part of the PRC, but they still see themselves as part of China. They still see Taiwan as being within the borders of China because it's been like that forever. And their people want to maintain national sovereignty. So when these U.S.-backed separatists tried to get rid of the Constitution that's been enacted forever, the Kuomintang were like, no, get the hell out of here. Yet the U.S. claims that's what the people in Taiwan want, right? That's what they all want, is separatism. No, the Taiwanese separatists are the U.S. That's the only Taiwanese separatists, them and their lackeys, people getting directly funded by U.S.-backed NGOs. So there were a handful of revisions that were made to this over the years. Essentially, what these revisions did was, here's first through seventh, they brought Taiwan and China closer together. Like the first revision saw Taiwan adopt aspects of the Chinese constitution, made Taiwanese citizens subject to PRC laws, which was the precondition that had been laid to national unification, was having the same constitution and laws. It brought Taiwanese citizens into the National Assembly eventually, made Taiwan subject to the executive office of China, the Yuan, and established a semi-presidential system, which is why Taiwan still has their own president today. It's not like a real president, it's like a semi-executive office that was established as sort of a transition, and because the ultimate goal for China is reunification, right? Bringing Taiwan into the PRC fully and bringing them into the socialist economy. There isn't, majority support for that yet, but by meeting the Taiwanese people's needs and ensuring economic development for them and slowly bringing them into the mainland, that was the plan for reunification. It wasn't planned to happen for years and years and years and years. Now, with the U.S. meddling and with the U.S. militarization of Taiwan and trying to inflame hostilities between Taiwan and China, that plan for reunification might look different, right? China might not be able to just continue slowly bringing Taiwan in while developing them economically until the point where the countries can reunify. The U.S. is going to do everything they can to break that up, which is why you have U.S. officials openly saying now that they want to blow up Taiwan semiconductor factories, which, yeah, that'll help the people of Taiwan blow up their jobs, blow up their infrastructure, blow up their factories. The U.S. is so benevolent and kind. But anyways, what some of the most interesting parts of the revisions to the Constitution that came in the 90s and early 2000s was they ensured economic development for the people of Taiwan, right? So there were the legal and political developments that brought Taiwan and the mainland closer together, but they also determined that the state has to promote the development of industry and the economic well-being for the people, which were the goals and the founding principles of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party. We're going to meet the needs of the people, so they support us, right? They were moving towards meeting the needs of the people in Taiwan. They made it mandatory for the government to finance small and medium enterprises there, fund social relief and assistance programs, provide employment for the citizens, protect their indigenous communities, ensure the livelihood of retired military members. These were some of the guarantees that were enacted by the PRC to try and bring Taiwan into the Chinese socialist economic system. So there's the terrorizing of Taiwan, the authoritarianism of socialism and communism, right? The communists made sure that the Taiwanese people's economic needs were met. Oh no, those bastards! How could they? How could they meet the people's needs? Surely Taiwan will want to go to war with China soon because it's convenient for the U.S. So the seventh revision to the Constitution said that China's existing borders and territories cannot be changed unless voted on by a majority of Chinese legislative bodies. And I don't know when that seventh revision was, 2004, right? So in 2004, Taiwan and China are saying our borders will not change. Taiwan is part of China, period. That's what's been agreed upon. That's what we've decided. We're not going to change that. But the U.S., of course, giving their own narrative, claiming Taiwan is its own country and everyone there wants to be their own country, and China's authoritarian for trying to hold on to Taiwan. Eventually, with that seventh revision, the Taiwan's National Assembly was abolished and the powers were transferred to the people, and their people were given more direct say in who their representatives are in the PRC. So, main points. These documents that Danny Haiphong shared are what established the relationships or the relations between China and Taiwan. The US agreed to these, agreed to the one China, two systems policy, right? There's going to be two economic systems here. Taiwan gets the right to choose their own economic system, but they're still part of China, right? They're still the same country. The US agreed to that legally, and now they're going against it, changing their mind because it's convenient. Another main point, the vast majority of Taiwanese people see themselves as being part of China. Another point, the reunification process has continued gradually, and it wasn't planned to be finished for years and years and years. Slowly, 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 Taiwan was being brought into the political and legal system of the mainland, and their economic needs were being met by the socialist economy. The U.S. agreed not to mediate relationships or relations between Taiwan and China. And yet we have Nancy Pelosi running around Taiwan, pretending like she's the savior of Taiwan, bringing them freedom, as if she's not there, essentially illegally, as if she doesn't know that she's not wanted there because the U.S. agreed to leave their people alone, and yet she won't because she can't help but meddle in other countries and provoke hostilities with other countries. So the U.S. going back on their promises as always. And yeah, the last point that I have about these documents is Nancy Pelosi can suck it. I literally have that written down in my notes. So you see here, now that you know a little bit about the history of Taiwan, and maybe you didn't before, Nancy Pelosi Taiwan visit. Pelosi leaves Taiwan, but tensions rise in her wake. Like, no shit. No shit. It's almost like you guys agreed at the United Nations. It's almost like you agreed in written laws that you wouldn't try to mediate the relations between China and Taiwan, and you agreed to allow them to be one country. You agreed that Taiwan was part of China. Yet you had Nancy Pelosi, one of the most powerful insider traders and financial oligarchs in the United States, go to Taiwan and inflame hostilities, inflame tensions. Oh, tensions rose in her wake. That's crazy. I thought she was going to bring peace. I'm so used to the U.S. bringing other countries peace. Of course it raised tensions. You just blatantly lied to these people and then threatened them. And that's the U.S. arrogance and ignorance, right? So normal people, regular people, especially Americans, because we're kept in the dark about all this, don't know about those agreements, don't know about those laws, don't know about that constitution. People in China do, right? Because they see it on the news. And, the U.S. would claim it's all propaganda, but all China has to do is show their people the truth, show their people what the U.S. agreed to. So Chinese people are aware that the U.S. has agreed to respect their sovereignty and that Taiwan is part of China. But then when the U.S. starts trying to inflame hostility and Nancy Pelosi is doing her thing, the U.S. is lying about it. They're lying about, no, China seized Taiwan. China seized Taiwan. It wasn't the nationalist government who said Taiwan's part of China, which is a claim that the PRC inherited. That's not the case, even though that's the reality. China seized them. Everyone in Taiwan wants independence. No, they don't. That's a lie too. Right? So it's not only these arrogant, belligerent actions by the finance capitalists and by the financial oligarchs like Pelosi, but it's the lies that are used to justify it. Right? The claiming that China's a liar. All China has to do is bring out the documents that the U.S. signed and agreed to, and you can see that the U.S. is lying and inflaming hostility. But then the U.S. claims, no, China's lying. Right? China's lying so they can oppress the people of Taiwan. Don't you care about the people of Taiwan? Support us. Support us in our effort to freaking destroy the whole of China. So absolutely absurd. And it's very similar, and some of you are probably realizing this already, very similar situation to Ukraine, Taiwan is. And it's going to be the U.S.'s launching point, or, where the U.S. tries to hit China. The same way that they did a coup in Ukraine and spent so much money controlling Ukrainian politics, so much money building up a pro-NATO, pro-US military force in Ukraine. Angela Merkel straight up admitted that the 2014 Minsk agreements, which were never signed, were ultimately just a way to buy time so that NATO could build up forces in Ukraine and eventually attack Russia. But they're going to try and do very, very similar things in Taiwan. But it's a different situation, too. Ukraine was granted independence at one point, and it wasn't two systems, one country. It was two countries, one system under the Soviet Union. They both had a socialist economic system, but Ukraine was granted national sovereignty. And the U.S. was able to foster this separatist Ukrainian nationalist ideology since before World War II. This Stepan Bandera anti-Russian ideology, Ukrainian nationalist ideology, that's been very useful for them to this day. And they were able to bring those Ukrainian nationalists to power of the government with the 2014 Maidan coup. That's what they're trying to do in Taiwan. But like we mentioned, not that many people support separatism. Even the Kuomintang, who were the U.S.-backed forces in the Chinese Civil War, are against separatism. They still see themselves as being the same country as the mainlanders. So the U.S. hasn't been as successful in supporting separatism as they have been in Ukraine. But it'll be interesting to see how they try and change that, right? See how they try and inflame hostilities and use Taiwan as a puppet, right? By bringing these Ukrainian nationalists, these anti-Russian nationalists to power in Ukraine, they've been able to very easily been able to use them as puppets against Russia, because these people, these neo-Nazis who U.S. NGOs have been backing and arming and supporting forever in Ukraine since like the 90s, already hate the Russian people. They already want to make Russian speaking illegal. They already wanted to make Stepan Bandera a national hero. So they immediately started attacking the Russian speakers in the Donbass in East Ukraine as soon as they came to power and as soon as these neo-Nazi elements were filtered into the government. Right? I don't think there's such a political party or such a nationalistic type group with that kind of power in in Taiwan. I just don't see it. Most of the anti-China political groups in Taiwan, they do exist. Most of them are like not in support of military action against China. That's like under 10% support in Taiwan, and that's a survey conducted by the White House. But there's just not that many people who want military action against China. They know they would lose. They know, and more importantly, they know their economy is dependent on China, right? Which is why those resolutions we just covered are so important, where China said you need to provide employment, you need to take care of the livelihood of people. If Taiwan is going to be part of China, we need to have social programs that ensure their well-being. All right, this has always been the core of Chinese socialism, Chinese communism. Serve the needs of the people if you want the people to support you, right? That was the number one goal of the communists after they took power at the end of the Civil War. How do we meet the people's needs? How do we meet the people's needs? How do we meet the people's needs to consolidate their support, to get support from them? So by meeting the needs of the Taiwanese people and building up their economy, the people of Taiwan understand that their economy would be screwed if it wasn't connected to China at all. And they're less likely to go along with these U.S. Regime change efforts, unlike the Ukrainian goofy-ass neo-Nazis who were tricked into power by the U.S., tricked into fighting this horrible proxy war against Russia by the U.S., or being pushed by NATO to their death, pushed by NATO at gunpoint to their death at the hands of the Russian military. I don't think people in Taiwan will be so foolish, but time will tell. Russia is helping Ukraine regain their sovereignty by denazifying and disarming NATO. I mean, literally, look at study the Maidan coup, read Ivan Kachinovsky's work. If you don't want to watch Ukraine on Fire by Oliver Stone, read the work of Ivan Kachinovsky, the peer-reviewed academic studies that go in depth about the Maidan coup and about the snipers who fired on protesters and the police. And that work is now being suppressed, as we covered yesterday. Kachinovsky's work is now being suppressed by the U.S. State Department and by the Academy, various academic journals at every turn. because they don't want the truth to get out, even though it's a rigorous academic analysis of what happened. But literally, like, it was a band of neo-Nazis, like this small percentage of people who really did want to, take Ukraine and attack Russia, despite knowing that Ukraine's military was not up to those standards and wasn't ready for such a thing. And he took those violent extremists and put them in power of the government, and then just tried to build them up to the point where they could actually attack Russia. And that's the thing. More and more of those troops were being trained, and they were being trained to be NATO interoperable, meaning those troops could, work with any NATO battalion from any country in Europe or North America. They could work together. That's what NATO was doing with Ukraine's troops, building up troops after they had installed this neo-Nazi government, and after they had promised Russia that they wouldn't add Ukraine to NATO. Like, yeah, we won't add Ukraine to NATO. We'll just install a NATO puppet dictatorship and then start making all of Ukraine's troops NATO interoperable, including the neo-Nazis, who, by the way, we added to the actual Ukrainian military. So they're part of the actual military now, and they hate Russian people, and they don't think that speaking Russian should be legal in their country. But don't worry. That's not us inflaming hostilities with Russia. Everything's fine. Russia was unprovoked. Oh, to say Russia was unprovoked. When people say that, I'm like, what fucking world do you live in? Like, what? How empty is your brain? Or like, what world do you live in? Where, like, what? It's hard for me because I don't trust mainstream media anymore. So I usually just consume things from academic sources or, journalists who I know actually have integrity, or alternative media, not people who are just telling blatant lies. So then when I talk to somebody who watches Fox News or MSNBC all day and they're like, Russia was unprovoked, I'm like, wow, the fuck? Like, how do they even make that argument? How can anyone even make that argument? And then I watch MSNBC for 2 seconds. I'm like, oh, that's how. They just lie. Just make everything up.